The Young and the Restless spoilers Monday update full September 2nd, 2024. Lily's mind was a whirlwind of calculated plots and simmering resentment. She had spent countless nights strategizing, driven by a singular goal: to bring Billy down. It wasn't just about power or revenge. It was about teaching him a lesson he would never forget. Billy had crossed too many lines, taken too many liberties, and now it was time for him to understand what it felt like to be truly powerless. But Lily's plan wasn't just to humiliate him. She wanted to strip him of his confidence, to make him feel so utterly useless that he would have no choice but to crawl back to Jill, only person who could rebuild him. Billy, on the other hand, was blinded by his own vendetta. His hatred for Adam had consumed him, clouding his judgment and driving him toward a path of destruction. The betrayal by Chelsea was the final straw. Billy believed that Adam had orchestrated everything, pulling the strings behind the scenes to tear his life apart. It was a narrative that Billy had convinced himself of, and now he was determined to make Adam pay. Every thought, every action was directed toward revenge, but in his obsession, Billy failed to see the larger game being played around him. Lily watched with a cold satisfaction as Billy became more and more isolated, his focus narrowing to a single point of hatred. She knew that this was the moment to strike, push him over the edge and into the arms of Jill. Jill had always been the one person who could pull Billy out of the darkness, the only one who knew how to reignite the fire within him. But Lily needed Billy to reach rock bottom first, to feel the weight of his failures pressing down on him until he was desperate for help. It was the only way to ensure that when he rose again, he would be stronger, and more importantly, he would never forget who had the power to break him. Meanwhile, Claire was caught in her own battle, one that was more personal but no less intense. Her arguments with Victor had become a regular occurrence, each one more heated than the last. Victor, ever the patriarch, demanded loyalty above all else. And now, with Victoria no longer by his side, he needed someone he could trust implicitly. Claire, with her sharp mind and family ties, was the obvious choice. But there was a catch. Victor had never approved of Claire's relationship with Kyle, and his disapproval was becoming increasingly aggressive. For Claire, being with Kyle and Harrison had brought a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Their little family unit, however unconventional, had given her a refuge from the storm that was her life. But Victor saw things differently. To him, family was everything, but only under his terms. Claire's involvement with Kyle was a distraction, a potential weakness that Victor could not afford. He needed her focus, her loyalty, and he needed it directed toward him. The idea of Claire wasting her time on a relationship he deemed doomed was intolerable. Victor's solution was as ruthless as it was simple. He wanted Kyle to end things with Claire. It wasn't enough for Claire to walk away on her own. No, Victor wanted her heart broken, her hopes crushed. Only then, he believed, would she return to the family fold, fully committed to the role he had planned for her. But despite his power, Victor knew that he could not force Kyle's hand. He had to tread carefully, using influence and suggestion rather than overt demands. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience and precision, traits that Victor had honed over a lifetime. As the tension mounted, Claire found herself increasingly torn. The serenity she found with Kyle and Harrison was a balm to her soul, but Victor's demands were relentless. Each argument with him chipped away at her resolve, leaving her exhausted and unsure of her future. She knew that Victor would never give up. He would continue to push until he got what he wanted. Claire also knew that she couldn't simply walk away from Kyle and Harrison. They were her sanctuary, and the thought of losing them was unbearable. Victor's campaign against her relationship with Kyle was intensifying. Claire was determined to stand her ground. She had fought too hard, endured too much to let Victor dictate her life. But the pressure was mounting, and Claire could feel the walls closing in. She needed to find a way to navigate this minefield without losing everything she held dear. As the days passed, stakes continued to rise. Billy's obsession with Adam was spiraling out of control, driving him closer to the brink. Lily watched from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Claire, caught in the crossfire between her love for Kyle and her loyalty to Victor, was struggling to maintain her composure. And Victor, ever the strategist, was moving his pieces into place, ready to make his next move. In this high-stakes game of power, revenge, and manipulation, each player was driven by their own motivations, their own desires. But as the web of intrigue tightened around them, one thing was certain. No one would emerge unscathed. Lily's plan to break Billy, Victor's efforts to control Claire, and Billy's quest for revenge against Adam were all converging toward a dramatic climax, one that would leave lasting scars on everyone involved. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the question remained: who would come out on top, and who would be left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives?
Daniel's heart raced as he pieced together the disturbing truth of Sharon's intentions. The realization that she could be capable of such a heinous act shook him to his core. He knew he couldn't take any chances, not when his daughter's safety was at stake. From that moment on, Daniel made a vow to himself: he would not leave his daughter's side for even a second. His every waking moment would be spent watching over her, protecting her from the threat that lurked too close to home. Heather, ever the pragmatist, tried to reason with him. She saw the strain in his eyes, the way his nerves were frayed from the constant vigilance. "Daniel, you're overreacting," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Sharon would never harm a child. This is all just a misunderstanding." But Daniel's instincts told him otherwise. There was a darkness in Sharon's eyes that he couldn't ignore, a shadow that seemed to grow with each passing day. "I can't take that risk," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Something's not right, Heather. I feel it in my bones. And I won't forgive myself if anything happens to our daughter." Heather sighed, frustrated by his refusal to see reason. Yet, deep down, she knew Daniel was a good father, and his protective instincts had never led him astray before. So, she relented, albeit reluctantly, and allowed Daniel to continue his self-imposed watch. Sharon, on the other hand, found herself unnerved by Daniel's constant presence. Everywhere she turned, he was there, his eyes tracking her every move, his footsteps echoing behind her as if he were her shadow. It was as though Daniel had become omnipresent, his very existence a barrier between her and the dark deeds Cameron was urging her to commit. At first, Sharon tried to shake him off, to continue with her plan undeterred. But Daniel was relentless, his dedication unwavering. He was always there, always watching. Sharon's resolve began to crumble under the weight of his scrutiny. Every time she thought she found a moment of privacy, Daniel would appear, his presence a silent warning that he knew what she was up to and that he wouldn't let it happen. The pressure became too much. Sharon's carefully constructed plan started to fall apart at the seams. The syringe she had hidden away remained unused, and the poison that was meant to end a life sat untouched. Cameron's voice, once so strong in her mind, grew faint as Daniel's vigilance drowned out the darkness that had taken hold of her. Eventually, Sharon realized there was no way to move forward without being caught. Daniel's dedication to his daughter had thwarted her every move, leaving her no choice but to abandon her plot entirely. Meanwhile, Victor was growing impatient. His ambitions to bring down Jack were as fierce as ever, but the timeline was dragging, and he couldn't afford delays. Jack was a formidable opponent, and Victor knew that any hesitation could be his downfall. He needed to act swiftly, decisively, to ensure his victory. But there was a new complication: Kyle. Once a loyal ally, Kyle had become a thorn in Victor's side. The younger man had shifted his focus entirely to securing custody of Harrison, a battle that consumed all his attention and energy. Kyle had begun ignoring Victor's directives, choosing instead to follow his own path, one that led away from the war Victor was waging against Jack. This defiance did not sit well with Victor. He had spent his life building an empire, and he expected loyalty from those he deemed worthy of being part of it. Kyle's insubordination was not only an inconvenience, it was a challenge to Victor's authority. And challenges were something Victor did not tolerate. Victor decided that if Kyle wouldn't fall in line, he would have to be taught a lesson. A lesson in loyalty, in power, and in the consequences of crossing Victor Newman. Kyle's choice to prioritize his own battle over the family's war was a mistake, and Victor was determined to make sure Kyle regretted it. Whatever it took, Kyle would learn that defying Victor came with a price that, in the end, might be too steep for Kyle to pay. As these tangled webs of loyalty, power, and betrayal continued to weave together, the stage was set for an inevitable clash. Daniel's protective instincts had saved his daughter from a terrible fate, but in doing so, he had unknowingly placed himself in the crosshairs of a much larger conflict. Victor's plans were moving forward, and Kyle, for better or worse, was about to discover what it truly meant to defy a man like Victor Newman.